Yeah, my name is Bratt, and I'm going to present on a bit of research that I've done. Kind of a work in process, progress or whatever, and kind of incomplete, but what's ever really complete, I don't know. I'm going to cruise through at lightning speed a lot of my methodology, because really what I want to do, what I think will be most interesting, and perhaps you might disagree, I don't know, is that we might have a bit of a conversation. So I'd like to say some stuff, and I'd love for you all to say some stuff back while we go over the next 25 minutes or so, if that's cool with you. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time with the sort of setting up, but I do think it's important that I give you a little bit of context around the analysis that I've done. I don't know why it's not. Oh, maybe it's not turned on.
It's the energy exercises.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Is this thing? Yeah. So, I have a professional hat collection, so to speak, meaning that I do a bunch of jobs. And I work in Victoria. You could say I'm sort of a therapist and educator in the sense that I talk about stuff and I do what often gets called psychoeducation in certain contexts. One of the places I work at, I work as a counselor with the Victoria Women's Transition House Society. I work with kids there. I work for an organization called Learning Through Loss, where I do grief and loss groups with youth, and I also go around to schools and I talk about grief and loss at the schools. I also have my own private practice. I'm I just work for all sorts of folks who get in touch with me and want to do some counseling work. And then I also work at the Men's Trauma Center, where I work, my title there is therapist. So a little bit of background on the methodology, how I got into doing what I have been doing. Is anybody in the room familiar with Alan and Linda Coates' paper on the 4 operations of language? Yeah, okay, show of hands. People are mostly pretty familiar with this? Excellent, okay, cool. So, real simple, language can be used to conceal violence, to obscure and mitigate perpetrators' responsibility for violence, to conceal victims' resistance, and to blame and pathologize victims. And they've done a really, really nice job of making it super clear how different people, largely in various positions of power, judges, lawyers, psychiatrists, these kinds of folks, do these things, misrepresent violence, misrepresent victims' resistance, and they call for a shift in our attention toward more accurate representations of these kinds of things. And I kind of got thinking, well, we know that violence and victims' responses, victims' resistance to violence gets talked about in these ways by these particular people, but I've also been working in what I call the anti-violence field for a handful of years, and I noticed that these ways of talking are pretty common. Does anybody else in here identify themselves as working in that field as well? Yeah? Okay. And are you familiar with that too? Like, kind of these ways of talking about things? Yeah? Okay. So, So I think it's important to ask, who do we work for, hey? And I know that sometimes, the answers to that could be, well, I work for the health authority, and I work for the ministry, and I work for this nonprofit, and that sort of thing. But really, at the end of the day, we're working with the people. We're sitting in a room with having a conversation. And so I think it's really important that we use language that serves those people that we're sitting in rooms having conversations with. So I'm aware that across vast contexts, and even I work across pretty vast contexts, I wear a whole bunch of different kinds of hats. I know that we work with people responding to various forms of violence and adversity, and I happen to think, you might disagree with me, I don't know, but I'm inclined to think not, that we as anti-violence workers, as people doing this work in the field, should be talking about these things in the most accurate, most fitting, most representative way. Would you agree? Okay, fantastic. So, I think this requires us to be really aware of the implications of the words that we use. And really, at the end of the day, this is about providing good, positive, supportive, understanding, accurate responses to victims, and holding perpetrators and the systems that enable violence accountable. So, it was a couple of years ago, and I saw Alan and Linda presenting Calgary. I understand there's probably, I recognize a couple of faces here from Calgary, who I think were probably there as well. And I got this idea, it's like, so to what extent do Canadian anti-violence agencies misrepresent violence and victims' responses to violence in their online public material? I was thinking online public material because we live in this world where people don't really go to libraries and look at encyclopedias all that much anymore. People pull out their little telephones that have like this wealth of information attached to them and type stuff in, and they say, oh, okay, I'm learning about something here. And so that's where the information is nowadays. And so I thought it was probably important to see how the information that is available to the public by anti-violence agencies represents or misrepresents violence. So what I did is I got on the old computer and I started doing a little bit of typing into Google and seeing, I decided to look sort of coast to coast, starting in Victoria, moving all the way to Newfoundland, and seeing just who is doing anti-violence work in all these different places. I looked mostly at major centers, and in the end I looked at 43 different agencies, and this included transition houses, women's shelters, sexual assault centers, and other sort of anti-violence focused organizations, nonprofits, that sort of thing. And I applied these 4 operations of language to the information, to the language that was used on the websites. In the end, I pulled 141 examples of text from those websites, and I categorized them according to the operations that they fit with. So, now, you'll see from this breakdown that the math looks a little funny. But out of 141 examples, I found that 13 concealed violence, 78 of those obscured or mitigated perpetrator responsibility, another 78 concealed victims' resistance, and 25 blamed or pathologized victims. Now, the reason that that math is a little bit questionable is that it was really, really hard to find examples that fit into only one category. Really, really common, even in just a really brief, simple statement for an example that I was looking at to fit across maybe 2, maybe even 3, maybe even all 4 operations of language. And so I made note of that. Yeah. So then I did something to, make sure that I wasn't too out to lunch. And I asked some of my buddies to take a look, some of my response-based cohort, to review a handful of examples, 10 examples that I pulled, and see how they would rate them. I explained how I did it. I explained kind of what my logic was, and in the end, we had 81% agreement. So for the most part, they had a pretty good sense that the way I was seeing things was how they would also describe them. 19% disagreement, of course, and my understanding of why that is because this is not like measuring the circumference of a grapefruit or something like that. Like it's a subjective evaluation of text. So it's very, this is not rocket science or hard science or anything like that. It's just, this is my opinion on these things, and it just so happened that the folks I asked to take a look at it thought that it was, pretty accurate.
We've internalized our validity.
Exactly. So now this is where I want you to come in. I just want to share a few examples, one example from each operation of language, and invite you to just kind of do your own analysis. Throw out there how you see it fitting within the particular operation that I categorized it in. And you might actually disagree with me, and that's totally cool. So this first one comes from an organization called Homefront Calgary. There's their website. They're in Calgary, Alberta. Oh, that's not supposed to happen. Oops a daisy. Oh well, I don't know what to do with that. You know, spoiler alert. Anyways, the Domestic Conflict Response Team proactively addresses families impacted by domestic violence once they have come to the attention of major intervening systems. Now you kind of see what I was thinking here about how that fit within that category. What do you guys think? Like, what is there anything else in that that you think maybe fits within this category of concealing violence in that statement? Good point, hey? That didn't cross my mind, but yeah, good point. Yeah, kind of funny. I mean, the language that gets used is I think, you know, if we were to put on a different analytical lens, and you know, we might notice other sort of funny little things like that. But sure, yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Informating that violence is a one-way action, as I think in response space, like a conflict kind of assumes that there's conflict between two people.
So it's mutualizing, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And so, really good point as to, I mean, I think you're 100% right. But you know, it really makes it clear how it's difficult to pigeonhole any one statement within any one particular operation. In this case, you know, I thought that this term domestic conflict conceals violence. Like, what are we talking about? Like, are we talking about, like, you know, like a Flames fan versus an Oilers fan, and, you know, they're living under the same roof, and, you know, they just cannot agree on, you know, which hockey team is superior? Are we talking about, like, I don't know, just two people having a polite and civil disagreement, or are we talking about somebody seriously doing harm to another person? So for obscuring and mitigating perpetrator responsibility, fingers crossed that the right thing comes down this time. I looked at the Edmonton Women's Shelter, and they said, if you feel like you have to walk on eggshells around your partner, constantly watching what you say and do in order to avoid a blow-up, chances are your relationship is unhealthy and abusive. So what strikes you in that statement as perhaps fitting within this operation of obscuring and mitigating perpetrator responsibility?
Unhealthy and abusive is mutual.
Aha, hey? Yeah. Takes maybe two to tango in the creation of an unhealthy relationship or an abusive one. Yeah. Anybody else have anything they want to add to that, or maybe they see it a little differently?
It's entirely focused on the victim's actions and not the perpetrator's actions.
You bet, hey? Yeah. So you're the one walking on eggshells here, right? Yeah.
Well, the indicators of a problem are resistance.
Yeah. Totally. But there's kind of this negative bias, hey? Like, there's this negative slant to it. Yeah. Like, you probably shouldn't be walking on eggshells, and you should probably do something differently about that. Yeah. Yes.
What's unhealthy and abusive?
Right, hey? Sure. Yep. Yeah.
Well, the relationship is what's unhealthy and abusive.
Right, hey? Yeah.
The personal behavior.
Right, yeah, and it's not a person, so it's anthropomorphic. It's turning a relationship into an entity that is then doing harm to maybe both people in it, maybe one person. We don't really know. Yeah, totally. Yeah, but it does a really nice job of obscuring perpetrator responsibility in that regard. I would say that, yeah, totally. You know, this language of health. I'm really not a proponent of health discourse when we're talking about violence, and it's super duper popular. I think that you know, if there was a list of words that I think would be really helpful for us to remove from our vocabulary as anti-violence workers, health would be a really big one. Unless we're talking about, like, maybe you know, something more related to physical health, but and I you know, I don't know. At the same time, maybe, I don't know if this is a devil's advocate thing to say or something like that, but I mean, certainly violence does threaten our physical integrity and our health and well-being, but it's not the relationship that's doing that, and if somebody is being hurt by another person, person is not an the victim is not an unhealthy person, you know, in lieu of that. Yeah. I also think that we should take the word relationship out of a lot of the descriptions that we used to. So for concealing victims' resistance, this comes from Brandon, Manitoba, a town I've driven through many times. Has anybody ever been to Brandon before? Yeah, all right. Love that little church on the side of the road at the gas station. Checked out it a few times. It's like a church that's like, I don't know, it's really, really small, like the size of a playhouse almost. They say choosing to talk to a counselor is a smart thing to do if you feel that help is needed. Counseling is a process that can help you understand how you have been affected by a traumatic event. So, given that a read, what strikes you in that as maybe fitting with this operation of concealing victims' resistance? Sure, hey? Yeah.
You don't have the solution that the counselor does.
Yeah. Yesterday, there was this really interesting idea introduced about sort of this colonial code. And I don't know, to me, this kind of language strikes me as fitting within that, sort of this idea that you need this proficient person to help you see how you've been affected by this violence. Is there anything else that strikes anybody as concealing victims' resistance in that?
Yeah, it's a smart thing to do. I find that very condescending.
Sure, hey? Yeah. You know what would be the smart thing to do? Go talk to a professional about that, hey? Yeah. And what a way to keep us in business, right? Yeah. But, now this is maybe a controversial idea, but maybe not. I think we should be in the business of putting ourselves out of business. And I think part of putting ourselves out of business is really, really pushing for, you know, trying to use the best language that we can to talk about stuff, to provide the best social responses to people who really, really need them. So my sense was, hey, the language of effects conceals resistance. There we go. Oh, and it assumes that victims are passively acted upon. You know, so it's kind of like, I don't know, this bad thing just happened to me. What do I do next? You know, go talk to a counselor. They're going to sort you out. So, lastly, the last operation, blaming or pathologizing victims. Saskatoon Interval House. I'm from Regina. Saskatoon is kind of the Shelbyville to my Springfield. So here they're describing a counseling program, and the point of that counseling program is to educate women and their children through their professional services to achieve a violence-free lifestyle with client-centered services, education services, accountability, coordination, and integration. You guys okay? What's horrible? What? Okay. Come on.
Achieving a violence-free lifestyle.
But isn't that a good thing to work toward, you know? Shouldn't we want violence-free lifestyles?
Educate you so that you can achieve a violence-free.
Right, hey? Yeah.
You gotta educate them for them.
Yeah.
And their children.
Right, hey?
With professionals.
Yeah. Yeah.
One
Right.
that sticks out to me too is accountability.
Yeah.
That the women need to be accountable when really it's perpetrators that need to be accountable.
For sure, hey? Yeah.
Well, it's like saying the violence is occurring because you're not educated enough.
Mm-hmm.
So if we just educate you, we'll end the violence.
Come on, you dummies!
Yeah.
Yeah, right, hey? Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Anybody else? I heard a lot of groans, so. Have the groans been addressed pretty adequately? Yeah.
This accountability piece, kind of implying that maybe they're just a little bit not accountable right now.
Right, yeah.
Efficient.
Right. Well, it takes at least two to tango, doesn't it? Eh? Maybe, yeah. I mean, maybe not, but maybe that's kind of what they're getting at. I don't know.
It has a bit of that, like if you work hard enough, you can achieve it. Like somehow it's like losing weight or getting that good job, or like it's sort of all this notion that
Yeah.
the kind of work ethic.
Yeah.
To do it, you can
Yeah.
achieve something.
Yeah. Yeah, and we don't get enough of those messages that tell us we're not quite good enough, eh? Like, yeah.
I think the use of the word lifestyle is really interesting.
Yeah, right, hey?
I guess,
Yeah, it's like,
to an active lifestyle, or,
Yeah.
lifestyle of a rich and famous person. that kind
I'm a
of
vegan,
violence.
you know, whatever, you know. I lead a violent lifestyle. Totally, hey? So there was lots and lots of cases where multiple operations were at play, and that I think has already been made clear. Here's an example. In the Vernon Women's Transition House Society, children who witness the abuse of their mother or serious family conflict live in fear and anxiety, waiting for the next violent episode to occur. So, here's where things get a little trickier. What can you all point out as being, which operations of language kind of fit with this example, would you say? Okay. Right. Yeah. So maybe that notion conceals children's resistance to violence. They're just passive witnesses otherwise. Yeah.
Just waiting.
Mm-hmm. Is there? Yeah. Right. Just waiting. So yeah. That implies passivity as well, doesn't it? Yeah.
Kind of has a subversive like way of blaming your mother because it's like it's not about children witnessing their father being violent. It's about children witnessing the abuse of their mother, which then puts that responsibility back on her.
Right. So it obscures perpetrator responsibility. Yeah. The focus is entirely on the mother. Yeah. I know this is a controversial idea, but some folks have proposed calling a lot of the violence that we often are addressing or resisting, calling it men's violence. It's a controversial idea. Some people think it's a really great idea because it assigns a social agent to what we otherwise call violence against women or domestic violence or whatever. Something to think about. Is there anything else that you folks see that statement fitting within as far as these operations go?
Serious family conflict.
Yeah, what does that do?
Just makes it mutual again.
Yeah, hey, yeah. And conceals violence. Serious family conflict, are we talking about like, right, or whatever, hey? Yeah. So it obscures perpetrator responsibility through an agentless description of abuse against a woman. This term, just as you said, are we talking about violence, something else? I don't know. And conceals victim resistance by only mentioning the emotional responses children might experience, which, by the way, I think would be fair to call resistance. Anxiety, fear, like these are actually like really, as some folks might say, Alan might say, small acts of living in the sense that don't they serve the interest of survival, serve the interest of creating safety, these sorts of things. Like fear and anxiety are like actually really important things for us to feel. But they're talked about as though they're, so-called mental health problems or something like that. So how about accurate descriptions of violence? This is from Vancouver Rape Relief Shelter. They said, women, has a man in your life ever hit you, pushed you around, called you names such as stupid, ugly, crazy, nagging, etc., stopped you from seeing your friends or leaving the house, forced you to have sex when you didn't want to, asked you to perform sexual acts for cash, done things to frighten you, threaten you? You don't deserve to be treated this way. Now, I do have a little side note that I'll say about this that I think we could argue it's not totally accurate, but it does expose violence using clear descriptive terms like hit and pushed. It does elucidate perpetrator responsibility by naming the person who's actually doing the abuse, and it uses unilateral language. And it supports victims in resisting violence. Now, they are also using a language of sex. My sense of that is that, I don't know, I don't want to be arguing in favor of concealing violence, which we could argue that is doing. My sense of their rationale for that, having kind of checked out their website and everything, is that it maybe softens things a little bit, makes it a little bit more accessible to the people who might be checking it out.
Could be trying to meet them where they are.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course it places responsibility for violence on perpetrators. So it's not saying, women, has this ever happened to you? You need to smarten up. Yeah.
Finding the last one is pretty problematic in terms of like really heteronormative, if people get it as informative.
Yeah.
Only saying that like the binary of women and men in this
Yep, totally.
is super problematic for me. So not like naming those as problematic and just using check marks is not okay.
Sure. I appreciate you saying that, and you're totally right. Yeah. Yeah, and you know what? I mean, I was really paying attention to things according to these, according to this lens that I've been using. But you're absolutely right, and maybe that's an important piece of concealing violence as well. Yeah.
I also feel like it's important to acknowledge the sentence that's in there, asks you to perform sexual acts for cash.
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge conversation that is not actually, as an agency, maybe that's them making their statement about what their opinion is on sex work, but I think it's important to break that down.
Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah.
have very different opinions about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, yeah. As far as victim resistance goes, it really wasn't something that was talked about all that much. There was a couple examples. One was from the Victoria Sexual Assault Centre, which at the time was called the Women's Sexual Assault Centre. And they said that a lack of resistance on the part of the survivor of sexual assault or abuse does not imply consent. And there, of course, that it's assuming that victims don't resist sexualized assault. If victims are unable to stop it, that there was no resistance. With the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter, they said that whenever people are abused, they do many things to oppose the abuse and to keep their dignity and their self-respect. And this is called resistance. So I know Alan named the other day that the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter has a lot of really great resources and stuff online, a lot of downloadable stuff. I checked them out, and I definitely liked a lot of what they had to say. I definitely recommend checking it out. Yeah.
I think regarding number one, didn't they change their name to the Victoria Sexual Assault Center specifically to take the gendering out of it because they now work with trans
Totally.
people?
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yeah. 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 Thanks. Cool. Cool. I think getting to the end here, I just wanted to say a bit about social responses. It's really, I think it's well documented, certainly in response-based literature, but even in some trauma-informed literature. I think Judith Herman, I believe John Breer, note that social responses have a lot to do with how well folks fare down the road after they've been subjected to violence. And we know that these are really important things. There's really only one organization that alluded to the implications of social responses for victims, and that was the Men's Trauma Center in Victoria. They said part of their mandate is to assist agencies through educational research to improve their responses to their own male clients who may also be survivors of trauma. Now, of course, that disappears violence through this language of trauma, but it does acknowledge that, hey, it's probably important that we give positive social responses to victims. How are we doing for time, Kathy?
Oh, you just do 4 minutes.
4 minutes?
And I'm just going to come up and give some reflections.
Okay.
I don't need much time at all.
Okay. So I wanted to share a few. This is sort of getting away from looking at anti-violence agencies and looking more at media. But I wanted to share this because I think that we're a room full of people. And does anybody here, maybe you could just show by raising your hand, if you do anything on any sort of social media, Facebook, Twitter, anything like that? Yeah? Okay, okay. So that's great. These are forums to respond to various misrepresentations, which I find are really, really common out there. So I wanted to share a few responses, just sort of as examples, I guess, from Twitter. Some of them are political, some of them have to do, come from news agencies. So our very own Commander-in-Chief, Stephen Harper, said, our government has recently introduced 2 pieces of legislation to combat child sexual exploitation. And then he gives a link to read more. Now, of course, he wasn't really tweeting that. Somebody else did it for him. But just in response to that, I said, hey, PM Harper, consider revising sexual exploitation terminology. There's nothing sexual about violence or exploitation. Sexualized would be more accurate. I think that, it'd be kind of cool if, of course, he or whomever is running the Twitter account, doesn't say anything back. But wouldn't it be interesting if more people were saying something about this sort of thing, eh? Another example comes from CBC News, where they say sex traffickers are called master manipulators in a report. I said, hey, CBC News, sex trafficking is misleading and inaccurate. This was in reference to the article itself, some of the details. 13-year-old children do not have sex to sell. We're talking organized child rape. Another example comes from Huffington Post. Ex-Boy Scout describes the mental scars left by sex abuse. I know it's shorter. That's the thing about Twitter, hey? Is that like every character kind of counts. Like you don't have a whole lot of space to say stuff. But so I acknowledge the fact that, hey, maybe I'll give them the benefit of the doubt that maybe they're trying to use fewer characters or something. But sex and abuse are two different worlds. Sex implies consent. Sexualized is unidirectional, and more accurate. And one more from CBC. Soccer coach arrested for allegedly trying to meet 12-year-old girl for sex. And in response to that, I just said, 12-year-old girls cannot consent to sex, so calling it such is misleading, and the coach allegedly made plans to rape said girl. Again, just really highlighting what's actually going on. So I don't know if folks are doing this at all in their lives online and stuff like that, but it's something that I encourage. I think it's a really, really easy thing to do. You can kind of just do it on the fly. It takes a couple minutes or whatever, and I think it would be kind of cool to see more of this happening. Yeah. Any thoughts or anything in response to that?
Good idea.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm wondering about your research. Was there a piece of it of letting these agencies know about the problematic uses of language or giving them your research when you're done?
There was not. And in fact, man, I did this off the side of my desk. It was so tough to actually, I haven't published anything with it. So it's kind of, it's as I said, it's incomplete. I haven't addressed it with agencies, but I think that's not a bad idea. It's something that I would like to do, but I've got a lot of sort of balls in the air, and I just really haven't, I just, my attention has been elsewhere. Yeah. Cool.
Can I ask a quick question though?
Yeah.
How do people respond to your comments? I guess I'm curious about the social responses that those responses elicit from other.
Yeah, usually nothing. Yeah. There was another one. I should have included it. A few weeks ago, there was a child and youth care organization that they had an article or something like that about the effects of domestic violence on children. And I just said, do you acknowledge, I can't remember verbatim what I said, but something like, do you acknowledge how children respond to and resist violence as well? And they said, sometimes kids become bullies themselves, and other times they get mental health problems like anxiety and depression. And so I responded, again, just saying, how about ways in which children do things to create safety, or refuse to reproduce violence themselves? And, again, it's just crickets, Didn't get anything back from that. Yeah.
I do find that it does have, when it does catch on though, it's very powerful. Like, for example, the CRAT team in Victoria caught on to somebody, probably just like yourself, wanting to create awareness around language. Somebody from Saanich Police tweeted something about child pornography, and somebody said, if you could just change child pornography, the images of child sexual abuse, that would completely change the scope on how that child is viewed. And actually, Victoria, Saanich, all the police departments actually came together in a meeting with CRAT, and now all those departments no longer use child pornography in their reports. They put images of child sexual abuse. So
right. Okay.
it has happened.
It's a step in the right direction. Yeah.
So it is really important to just put those tiny things out there, even if it's something as silly as social media or as little as a letter. I do think it can have the capacity to change people's viewpoints. So
I would
good on ya.
Sure. I would love to see even, and I mean, this I think has to change on a bigger level, on a systemic level, on a legal level. I would love to see the word sexual taken out of there and replaced with sexualized to take out the mutualizing implications of the word sexual. But I mean, it is totally a step in the right direction, eh? Yeah. Cool. I think I'm done.
Okay. Well, thank you, Will. That was fantastic. Alan mentioned once that we're going to be launching a website soon called Tell It Like It Is, and it connects really nicely with what Will's doing here.
But Will's added another component because he actually does social media with the Twitter and stuff. But what we're getting at here is how do we organize? Because that's one of the things that those of us trying to really introduce social change in a positive direction, I think that we need to do that more and more. What's called the extreme right are so good at that, right? When something happens they don't like, man, they're there with a response. It's a collective, it's a force. But the rest of us, we're so scattered in so many ways that it's really difficult for us to form the group we need to march forth. And a great example is with the failure to protect legislation. We got word it was coming down. We started organizing. The center wrote a letter of protest. We wanted the women's groups to be kind of at the front of the charge against it, the protest against it. Well, by the time we began writing our letter, it was already going through legislation, the legislature, because we just didn't get any warning. And if we were as organized as the extreme right, we would have been able to, okay, now, let's mobilize. And so it's how to figure out how to do that when we're all so incredibly busy and overworked and we're juggling so many different things. But a Twitter idea of, trying to do that, wouldn't it be great if, 20 of us did what Will did, and suddenly the PM's office is getting 20, 30, 40 people saying, hey, what are you doing using that language? What do you think you're saying here? And maybe somebody at the PMO's office would actually notice. We've also tried responding to various groups and calling them on their language, and like Will, dead silence pretty much. So it'll take a while, but a group response on Twitter I think is a really fantastic idea. So thank you, Will.